What if the person you trusted most, the one who was supposed to protect you, became your greatest nightmare? In this chilling true crime story, a father and daughter embark on a journey that turns into a nightmare beyond imagination. What starts as an adventure in the woods quickly spirals into a web of darkness, betrayal, and terror. Stay with us as the story unfolds. You won't believe how it ends. This is a tale of survival, of secrets, and of a twisted fate that will leave you questioning everything. Don't miss a second of this spine-tingling journey. Hit play now, because you're about to hear the most shocking twist of all. The wind howled through the trees. A faint, eerie noise echoed across the dense forest. The air was thick with tension. Dark clouds covered the sky, blocking any trace of sunlight. Lena gripped her father's hand tightly, her breath shallow. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to make sense of the feeling crawling up her spine. "Stay close, honey," her father's voice cracked. His words were a mix of concern and fear. He had never sounded like this before. The path ahead was narrow. The woods were silent now, the usual hum of nature replaced by an unsettling stillness. Only the occasional rustling of leaves disturbed the silence. Lena's heart thudded in her chest, louder than the wind. Her father's hand felt cold, clammy. He had always been the strong one, the protector. But now she felt like she was the one holding him together. They walked further into the trees, the ground damp beneath their feet. The smell of wet earth filled the air. It should have been soothing, but it wasn't. It only made the fear worse. They were supposed to be on a hike, just the two of them. A father-daughter trip. But this wasn't a hike anymore. Lena stopped. She heard something.
A sound. A crack.
A snap. She turned to her father. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He was staring at something just beyond her. His lips trembled, but he didn't say a word. Lena followed his gaze. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the distance, was a figure. A shadow. Someone standing motionless among the trees. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. A chill ran down Lena's spine. Her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. Her father's grip tightened on her hand. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We need to leave."
Now.
But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. And with it, the reality of what was happening hit Lena like a punch to the stomach. Her father wasn't just afraid. He was terrified. She looked at him. His face twisted in shock. Horror. A distant scream echoed through the trees, too faint to be real, but too close to ignore. The figure was coming closer now, slowly, steadily. Its presence felt wrong, unnatural. Lena wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body was frozen. The figure stopped.
It was standing in front of them now.
Close enough that Lena could smell something rancid, like rotting meat. Her father let go of her hand. Lena didn't understand at first. But then it hit her. The way he turned. The way he stepped back. He wasn't looking at the figure anymore. He was looking at her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He reached for something hidden beneath his jacket. The glint of metal caught her eye. Her pulse raced. The truth hit her with devastating force. Her father wasn't trying to protect her. He was going to hurt her. And she knew in that moment she had no escape. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The air was thick, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her father's face was a mask of something dark, something unrecognizable. Lena's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Every muscle in her body froze. The world around her seemed to blur, the edges of reality slipping away. Her father's eyes locked onto hers, cold and empty. The glint of metal in his hand reflected the little light that filtered through the trees. A knife. She saw it now, clear as day. His hand shook, but not from fear. From anticipation. From something worse. Lena took a step back, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might shatter her eardrums. Her thoughts were scattered, disjointed. She wanted to ask why, to demand an answer, but the words wouldn't come. Not in the face of this. Her father's lips parted, but no words escaped. Just a dry, shallow breath. The figure in the distance remained silent, watching, waiting. It was impossible to tell who they were, just another shadow in the night. But Lena's focus was entirely on her father now, on the cold, ruthless look in his eyes, the anger boiling beneath his skin. With a swift motion, he took another step forward. The knife gleamed, and Lena's mind screamed at her to move. But her legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot. The wind howled again, carrying with it a distant sound. A faint cry. Someone was out there somewhere. But Lena couldn't take her eyes off him. She opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat.
Dad.
It was the first word she'd spoken since the moment of realization hit her. She barely recognized her own voice. It was hoarse, broken. Her father's hand clenched the handle of the knife tighter, his knuckles white. The air between them seemed to thicken, pressing down with unbearable weight. Lena took another shaky step back, her eyes glued to the blade. The forest around her felt suffocating now, the trees closing in, leaning in to watch. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The wind stopped. The silence was deafening. Her father's eyes flickered, just for a moment. A hesitation, a crack in the cold facade. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. And then, with a movement faster than she could react to, he lunged. The world seemed to slow, her heartbeat ringing in her ears as she stumbled backward. The sharp, metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth. She barely had time to scream before everything went dark. The world was silent for a moment, as if the air itself had held its breath. Lena's vision blurred, the ground beneath her feet unsteady. She felt the cold, sharp sting of something tearing through her skin. Her father's face hovered above her, twisted in something between sorrow and rage. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving as though the act had drained him completely. But it wasn't over. Lena's body was numb. She couldn't feel her legs, her arms. All she could feel was the cold, sharp pain in her side, a relentless pulse that seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. Her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. She tried to scream, but the sound barely escaped her lips. It felt like drowning in slow motion, each breath more shallow than the last. The blood, warm and thick, spread quickly around her, staining the earth. Her father leaned in closer. His face was so close, his breath hot against her skin, but his eyes were distant, vacant. Lena's vision swam in and out of focus. She could barely comprehend the image before her. His hands, still gripping the knife, shook violently now, as if even he couldn't understand what had just transpired. She wanted to move, to escape, but her body betrayed her. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The cold spread faster, sinking into her bones. "Why?" she whispered again, her voice breaking in a way that sounded alien even to herself. Her father didn't answer. Instead, he pulled away, stepping back as if he couldn't bear to look at her. The knife clattered to the ground, lost in the dark underbrush. The air was thick now, choked with the scent of blood and something darker, something that smelled like betrayal. The trees around them seemed to press in, watching, witnessing. Lena's eyes fluttered closed, the world darkening. The distant cries she had heard earlier, those screams, seemed to grow louder now. They rang in her ears, twisting with the horror of the moment. Her mind clung to that sound, grasping at any reality that made sense. Her last thought before the darkness consumed her was that of her father, the man who had once been her protector, the man she had trusted with her life. Now he was the one who had taken it. The darkness swallowed her whole. Lena's senses faded, one by one. The distant screams, the crackling wind, the smell of damp earth, all of it slipped into a void. Nothingness. But then there was a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing clearer. A low hum. The rustling of leaves, the crunching of twigs. Lena's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was a blur. Shapes and shadows danced before her like phantoms in the night. Her body felt impossibly heavy, and the pain was distant, like an echo she couldn't quite reach. She blinked, forcing her vision into focus. The trees, still standing silent and tall, seemed to tower above her. Their branches swayed, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. But it wasn't the trees she focused on. Her father was still there. He hadn't left. He was standing over her, his form now a twisted silhouette against the dim light of the dying day. The knife was gone, but his hands were stained. His shirt, too. Lena's breath hitched. He was looking at her, his face unreadable. For a moment, just a flicker, she saw something in his eyes. A trace of regret. A trace of doubt. But then it was gone. And in its place, there was only emptiness. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that pushed her body forward, forcing herself to sit up despite the unbearable weight of exhaustion. Dad. The word barely made it past her lips. Her voice was raw, almost unrecognizable. She felt as though she were speaking from somewhere far away. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. Lena's eyes roamed over the forest, searching for something, anything, that might explain this madness. The figure that had appeared before. Was it still there? Was this all some nightmare she couldn't wake up from? Her mind raced, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. And then, something more chilling than all of it hit her. The sound of footsteps. Not from her father. Not from the shadows. But from somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound was unmistakable now. Closer. Steady. Someone or something was coming. Lena's pulse quickened. Her hand reached for the ground, searching for anything to hold on to. The pain in her side was sharp, but her mind couldn't focus on it. The footsteps grew louder, and with them, a low murmur, almost like whispering. Lena's head spun. She turned to her father, but there was no recognition in his face anymore. He looked different now, hollow, distant, as though he were already a ghost. The whispers grew clearer. She could hear words, but they didn't make sense. A jumble of voices. Strangers. And then, from behind her, she heard a laugh. Low, guttural. A laugh that sent ice through her veins. Lena's breath caught. She knew, without a doubt, that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The laugh echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Lena's spine. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. An unmistakable, unsettling presence that pressed in from every direction, suffocating the air around her. She tried to stand, to move, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her legs trembled, weak and unsteady. She could feel the blood still warm and sticky against her skin, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her father stood motionless, his gaze locked on something in the distance, eyes wide, pupils dilated. His hands were still trembling, but not from fear, from something darker, something she couldn't understand. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Lena's pulse raced. She could feel the eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her breath became shallow, as if each inhale would be her last. Her mind screamed at her to run, but the fear paralyzed her. The shadows around her seemed to close in, their weight growing heavier with every passing second. And then suddenly there it was, a figure, emerging from the darkness.
Slow.
Deliberate. A shape moving through the trees like a phantom. Lena's heart skipped a beat. It was tall, taller than any human should be. Its silhouette was distorted, as though the shadows themselves were bending around it. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a blur of dark, hollow features. Eyes that seemed too deep, too endless, and a mouth stretched in a grotesque grin that never seemed to end. Lena gasped. The air turned cold, biting at her skin, but her father remained frozen, unaware of the creature that approached. The thing didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It simply watched, its hollow gaze fixed on Lena. And in that moment, she knew this was no ordinary man. This wasn't even human. Her father had brought her here. To this place. To this nightmare. She glanced at him again, desperate, searching for some hint of recognition. But his expression was vacant, his hands trembling as he stood still in the darkness. It was as if he hadn't noticed the figure before them, hadn't seen the danger that was closing in. The whispers became clearer now, surrounding her from all sides. They weren't voices. Not human voices. They were something else. Like the rustling of dry leaves, the cracking of branches, the shifting of shadows. Lena felt her body grow colder, as if the very air had turned against her. The thing before her reached out a long, spindly hand, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws. The nails scraped against the bark of a nearby tree as it drew closer. Her chest tightened, a wave of panic crashing over her. She couldn't breathe. Her body trembled uncontrollably. "Dad," she gasped, her voice a desperate whisper. But it was no use. He didn't move, didn't react. The thing was close now, so close she could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. Its hand stretched toward her, and without thinking, she screamed. But no sound came out. The world around her seemed to distort, like the forest itself was warping. The shadows blurred, the trees twisted. The thing was no longer just in front of her, it was all around her. And then she felt it. A cold, sharp sensation on her arm. A hand. Not her father's. The thing's hand. Lena's vision swam. Her body went numb. The world seemed to spin out of control. Her thoughts became tangled, and the air was thick with a foul stench of decay. Her last breath caught in her throat. Before the darkness consumed her completely, one final thought cut through the fog. This was the end. And it was her father who had led her here. The darkness swallowed her whole again, but this time it wasn't just the absence of light. It was a suffocating, oppressive force, pulling her deeper into the void. Her thoughts were fragments, scattered across the blackened space, barely connected. The cold felt endless. The pain, distant now, was nothing but an echo in her mind. Everything was silent. The world, the forest, her father, everything seemed to have disappeared. And yet, through the silence, a voice emerged. Soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably real. It wasn't human.
It couldn't be.
Lena. Her name was spoken with a slow, deliberate drawl, as though the very air itself was shaping the words. The voice seemed to crawl into her mind, its presence both foreign and familiar. Her father's face flickered in her memory, his eyes, empty, cold, haunting her thoughts. Lena's chest heaved in desperate breaths, though she couldn't feel her body. She couldn't feel anything except the oppressive weight of the voice, the presence that surrounded her. She tried to open her eyes, but it was as if her lids were sealed shut, as though the very act of waking would tear her apart. Why? The question slipped from her lips, barely audible. But it was the only thought that mattered. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. The voice responded, its tone low and predatory. You wanted answers. You wanted to know the truth. But truths, they're fragile things, Lena. Fragile and dangerous. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The voice continued, its rhythm hypnotic. Your father, he was never meant to protect you. You were never meant to be his daughter. The words twisted inside her, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. They didn't make sense, yet they did. They rattled her mind. They tore through her memories, distorting everything she thought she knew. A cold, terrible realization began to settle in her chest. The forest, the shadows, the figure that had watched her. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was something much worse. The voice shifted, taking on a new, darker tone. Your father, he is mine now.
And you?
You're the key to something far greater than either of us. You always were. Lena's heart pounded in her ears. The words felt like a trap, wrapping tighter and tighter around her mind, squeezing until there was no escape. She tried to move, to fight, but her limbs were immovable, weighed down by the unseen force surrounding her. She could feel it now, a presence, one that was as old as time itself, ancient and insidious. The thing in the forest, the thing that had once been her father, it wasn't alone. It never had been. With a jolt, Lena's vision snapped open, the world around her a blur of trees, dark and shifting. The shadows had grown deeper, darker. The air was thick with an unnatural cold. The thing that had been her father stood before her, but it was no longer him.
It was a hollow shell.
A vessel. And in his place was something far worse. A figure, dark and towering, its face hidden in shadows, the air around it crackling with energy. Its form was an abomination, half human, half something else entirely. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, piercing through the darkness, and its grin stretched too wide, too unnatural. Lena's breath hitched, but she couldn't speak. The words, the questions, they all died in her throat. The thing, her father, reached out, its hand cold and unforgiving, and Lena realized the truth. She had never escaped. She had never been free. This was never about her father. It was always about the thing in the shadows, the ancient evil that had been pulling the strings all along. And now Lena was a part of it. Forever. The hand reached for Lena, its fingers impossibly long, stretching through the dark air like the tendrils of a nightmare. She couldn't move, couldn't react, trapped within the grip of something ancient, something she couldn't understand. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest, but her limbs remained paralyzed. The presence around her was suffocating, its dark energy pressing down on her, suffusing the very air. The thing that had once been her father loomed above her, his eyes hollow, empty, but now flickering with something more, an unnatural, malevolent force that coursed through his veins, turning him into something unrecognizable.
Lena's mouth went dry.
The air tasted like rust and decay. She wanted to scream, but it was as though the world itself had stolen her voice. She wanted to fight, to break free, but there was no strength left in her body. Every part of her screamed to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. The thing that had replaced her father leaned closer, its breath cold and heavy against her skin, and whispered in a voice that was no longer human. You've always been a part of it, Lena. A part of us. The words scraped at her soul, sinking deep into the pit of her stomach. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't process what she was hearing. The realization was like a weight settling over her chest, suffocating her. No. The word finally escaped her lips in a choked gasp, but it felt empty, powerless. The thing that was her father chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the forest like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of something beyond understanding, something twisted, cruel. You were always meant to be more, it said, the voice chillingly calm. Your blood, your essence, it's part of something older than you know. And now you'll understand what it means to truly belong. Lena's heart sank. The world around her began to shift again, the trees bending in unnatural angles, the shadows growing, twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers grew louder, as if hundreds of voices were speaking all at once, somewhere beyond the veil of reality, just out of reach. She couldn't escape. She was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The thing that had once been her father stepped back slightly, allowing Lena to see the true horror behind his transformation. His body was no longer flesh and blood. It was a twisted mockery of life, an abomination stitched together by something far darker, something from beyond the realms of human understanding. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, alive, as though they were reaching for her, pulling her into them. The air hummed with an otherworldly power that made Lena's skin crawl. "You will never leave," the thing said, its voice echoing around her, seeping into her very bones. "You belong to the darkness now." Just like him, a cold, terrible understanding washed over Lena. The thing before her, the creature that had once been her father, was only the beginning. The forest, the whispers, the horrors that surrounded her, they were all part of something far greater, far more insidious. And she was now a part of it, too. The last thing Lena saw before everything went black again was the smile that stretched across her father's face, a smile that was no longer human, no longer anything she could recognize. The darkness consumed her once more, dragging her into its cold embrace. But this time, there was no hope for escape. No waking from the nightmare. She was lost to it forever. The darkness lingered, but it wasn't as suffocating now. Something was different, something had shifted. Lena's thoughts, hazy and fragmented, started to come back together, as if pieces of her consciousness were reassembling after being scattered by an impossible force. Her body ached with an unbearable weight, yet there was a strange clarity in her mind. She wasn't sure how long she had been in the darkness. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. The void had felt timeless, like a prison with no door. But now, as her eyes flickered open once again, there was a subtle difference. The air was no longer as cold. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by something new, something she couldn't fully comprehend. Lena's surroundings were still the same. An unnatural quiet settled over the forest, the trees standing still like silent sentinels, watching her with unseen eyes. But now she saw them differently. The darkness no longer seemed as infinite. It was finite,
Contained.
and in that moment, a thought pierced through the haze of her mind. She was still alive.
Barely.
Her body, battered and exhausted, screamed for rest. The pain in her side was dull, like a faraway ache that refused to go away. But the clarity in her mind kept her moving, kept her breathing. It was as if something, some force, had chosen her to survive, despite everything. Her father's twisted, empty face flashed in her mind again, but it was different now. No longer just a reflection of terror, he had become a symbol of something else, of the price she had paid, of the choice she had been forced into, and the horrors she had survived. She wasn't alone anymore. The thing, the entity that had consumed her father, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. But Lena's will was stronger now. There was a spark in her that refused to be extinguished. Her legs trembled as she slowly pushed herself upright, every inch of her body protesting, but she forced herself to stand. "I'm not done," she whispered to the still, silent forest. "Not yet." The wind began to pick up again, but it felt different now. It wasn't the chilling whisper of death. It was the rush of something alive, something fighting back. Something fighting with her. The shadows hadn't won. Not yet. She wasn't its prisoner. Not anymore. And as she stood alone in the heart of the forest, with the horrors of the past lingering in the air, Lena knew one thing for certain. She would find a way to escape. And when she did, she would make them all pay. The forest was still, but it wasn't silent anymore. There was a hum in the air, a pulse that seemed to thrum beneath her feet. Lena could feel it deep inside her bones, a connection, perhaps, to the darkness she had been pulled into, but also a force that was pushing her forward. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking, her legs numb with exhaustion, her mind still reeling from the horrors she had endured. But there was no time to stop. No time to rest. The whispers were distant now, but the fear of them still lingered. The memory of her father, of the creature he had become, haunted every step she took, every breath she drew. Lena had survived, but at what cost? The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The trees seemed to reach out to her, their twisted branches like arms trying to pull her back into the darkness. But she kept moving forward, her resolve hardening with each step. She was different now.
Changed.
The forest, once a place of terror, had become a strange kind of ally. The shadows no longer felt like enemies. They were just part of the world around her. She had learned to see them differently. She had learned to survive. And then, through the dense trees ahead, she saw it. A light. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew brighter as she moved toward it, a beacon in the suffocating darkness. A clearing. Her heart raced as she stepped into the open space, feeling the cool air brush against her face. The light came from a crack in the sky, a sliver of stars peeking through the veil of the night. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Lena felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't lost anymore. The forest, the darkness, her father's betrayal, it had all led her here, to this moment. She looked up at the sky, the stars shining down like 1,000 eyes watching over her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she smiled. She had made it out, and as the night embraced her once again, she knew that no matter what horrors lay ahead, she would never stop fighting. Because in the end, survival was the only thing that truly mattered. And she would survive.